Hey everyone, and welcome to another Konoha Reviews, where we review games both new and old on all platforms. If you like the content that I make, then please subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you never miss a review when it comes out. Today we talk about the game Resident Evil Village, which is also known as Resident Evil 8. This game has been on my radar ever since the announcement, and pretty much was my most anticipated game for 2021, a game year that has performed very poorly up until now, I would say. I remember the surprise I had when this game was first revealed, as the setting and feeling felt very different from many of the previous Resident Evil games we had. But then again, Resident Evil 7 was also drastically different than all the Resident Evil games that came before it, and I absolutely adored that game. Resident Evil, of course, reached legendary status with its earlier titles and later iterations like Resident Evil 4. However, over time the Resident Evil series really got saturated, and some downright horrible garbage titles were released, including Raccoon City, Umbrella Corps, and that god-awful Resident Evil 6. It really got to the point where whenever a new Resident Evil game was announced, I would just shrug my shoulders and check it if it kinda looked okay. It had lost every sense of the scariness or the horror element that made the first game so good, or the dread and great gameplay brought to us by 4. And I even still liked 5 because of the dynamic that co-op brought to it. But there too, the scare factor was nowhere to be found. Enter Resident Evil 7 then finally after all those years, and with its first-person view and its slow pace, it absolutely blew me away and earned the spot of best game in my top 10 of games that came out that year. It was so refreshing to have this game be taken in this new direction and nail the execution. Then thereafter, we got the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and though I really loved the Resident Evil 2 remake, the RE3 remake felt a bit rushed and way too short, with entire chunks from the original being cut out. Honestly, I was afraid that Capcom would wind down in that familiar pattern again and take out the scariness or simply going the easy route by cutting corners. Luckily though, I can wholeheartedly say that with Resident Evil Village, this is not the case, and they have delivered a product that is absolutely astounding and a true gem for lovers of horror, exploration, and adventure. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's take a deeper dive into this magnificent title. First, let's talk a bit about the story and the setting. Now, one might find it a bit surprising, but story actually used to be quite important and very well written for the very early Resident Evil games. Later on, the story often became a very simple matter of a new strain of the virus being unleashed and some scientists wanted to use it for world domination, blah 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 blah. But the first Resident Evil game had an incredible story, where the owner of the mansion you were exploring was doing terrible experiments on his daughter. Then a dangerous bioweapon was being created inside a secret laboratory, and even a traitor was in the midst of your team with his own agenda. The story was not so much at the forefront as with other adventure games, but it definitely went deeper than your average game, that is for sure. Resident Evil 4, for example, has a really simple, almost forgettable story, but the gameplay and characters are so good that you look past this. RE5 and 6 are also really simple and have forgettable stories, and Resident Evil 7 finally introduced a sense of mystery and wonder, as it felt like a reboot of the franchise with the Baker family, new main character Ethan, and even subtle hints linking the events to Umbrella, giving the player more questions and theories to chew down upon. The great thing about Resident Evil Village is that this sense of mystery and wonder continues. You play once again as Ethan Winters, main character from the Resident Evil 7 game, and this time a lot more talkative. You and your wife Mia, who of course also played a major role in Part 7, have moved to Europe and are living life as best as you can with a newborn in the family. Everything seems quiet and peaceful, but it wouldn't be a Resident Evil game if things didn't go balls up soon after. The game gets introduced with a beautiful drawn cutscene where a folk tale gets told by Mia to little Rose, your daughter. It's already pretty clear then that the story actually takes quite a lot of parallels with what is going to happen in the game. Within the first 10 minutes, your house suddenly gets assaulted by masked men and Mia is shot brutally in front of your eyes by none other than Chris Redfield, looking a bit beefier this time. Immediately with this premise, you have all these questions that are running through your head. Chris is a good guy, right? Then why did he kill Mia? Was Mia still possessed? Is the baby a threat? What do they want with the baby? You then shortly after wake up in a snowy mountain region next to a crashed truck and one of the masked men dead. You start to hike through the dark forest, and immediately it became clear that yet again they went for a slower approach in general, where they definitely have not forgotten about the scary factor in this game. RE Village definitely is a lot more action-packed than RE7, but it still knows it's a horror game at heart, and has multiple sections where this gets thrown into the forefront. It takes a good 20 minutes or so before you get your hands on your first weapon, and up until that point, the game already gets you in the mood as you hear weird noises in the dark forest around you and explore old abandoned huts that have seen better days. It's incredibly tense, and was so happy that they stuck with the slow, scary sections like this. Not too long after, it will become morning and you arrive at the village and the looming castle looking over it. I think this is then also a good time to say that this game absolutely looks gorgeous. It runs on the RE engine, which also is the engine that Resident Evil 7 ran on, so the technique might actually seem a bit dated, but everything in this game looks absolutely beautiful. Textures are sharp, particle effects are plentiful, and all the environments are chock full of detail. Houses really feel lived in despite most being abandoned, but they are littered with so many objects and assets to where it convinces you that people lived and breathed here. The environments are a true joy to explore and look upon, with nice details like religious artifacts and paintings, or plentiful of gory and scary looking effigies and mutilated corpses. The great thing about this setting is that it feeds into that mystery and wonder I was talking about earlier. When you first come to the village, you can explore a bit of it, but cannot really find anybody or anything to interact with. Yet you still have so many new questions running through your head with the things you see. Where did everyone go? The stew on the furnace is still steaming, so people were here just a minute ago. Did they leave? Were they killed? Why do they have so many religious artifacts and paintings? And who are the figures portrayed on those paintings? The game constantly throws you more and more of these questions, but answers them as well, and even rewarding the explorer by providing additional details and background lore via notes and other documents that you can miss, often telling more about the origins of the four lords, of whom we will talk about more shortly. Anyway, once you are done exploring part of the village and have calmed down from just how beautiful this game is, you stumble upon your first enemy, and this time it's not a zombie. Nor is it one of those disappointing black mold people that they had in Resident Evil 7. Honestly, one of the few disappointing things about that game were the regular enemy types because they were very generic and forgettable. But this time around, the enemy seems more werewolf-like, and not too long after, it is indeed revealed that they refer to them as Lycans, which is of course what werewolves are being called in other properties too, like Van Helsing or Underworld. There's a short section where you need to survive an incoming wave of enemies, including a very big one with a giant hammer, and this part clearly was an homage to the beginning of both Resident Evil 4 and 5, where you have that scary part where the entire village comes after you and you simply need to hold out until the church bell tolls. Well, that is exactly what happens here too, and once the coast is clear, you come across an old witch lady, which is straight out of an ancient fairy tale, complete with a witch-like laughter and a staff with skulls on it. And I have to say that I love that they went for this more traditional tone of horror with werewolves, vampires, witches, porcelain dolls, etc. In a sense, it's more comparable to Castlevania in terms of mood, or Bloodborne, of course, also comes to mind, but the cool thing is that this game still really feels like a Resident Evil game because of the gameplay and puzzles. And though of course Resident Evil is famous for being a game about zombies, the very first Resident Evil game already had many other enemies that were far off from the zombie type. You had giant snakes, giant spiders, mutant-looking hunters, giant sharks, enormous plants, etc. That's why it doesn't feel weird to suddenly have other creatures function as your enemy. But the overall tone definitely feels very traditional and folklore-esque, and I personally thought this was very cool and refreshing despite sounding pretty cliché on paper. Since by now we have also faced off against some enemies, let's now talk about how the game plays and feels in terms of combat. The fighting in the game feels pretty good and responsive, while at the same time not overpowering you to keep things tense. It's a great example of how to do combat right in horror games where you can fight back, but definitely feel like you are not at a big advantage. For the longest time it has been said that combat in horror games is made bad on purpose, but there are plenty of examples, even in great horror games like Silent Hill 2, where the combat mechanics absolutely suck to the point where it's just not implemented well, and the being done on purpose phrase is just being used as an excuse. Resident Evil Village shows how this has to be done, because after each shot, your crosshair will grow very wide for a second or so to replicate the kickback, and it means that you cannot really start spamming fire, since you most likely will miss a lot of shots. You can be pretty accurate with the weapons, but the enemies will often sway and dodge, making it difficult to hit them sometimes, and the widening crosshair makes it even more difficult to hit them if you panic when they dodge another bullet while getting closer and closer. Now, I have heard some people say that this is one of the easiest Resident Evil games out there, and though I definitely did not die a lot, I think I died twice from combat, and the only other time I died multiple times was during a timed section with water, where if you timed it wrong, you got an instant death. But despite not dying a lot, I have to admit that I still actually got hit and hurt a lot. Now, part of it was my mistake, for especially in the earlier stage of the game, not running away from the enemies that were getting closer, but also during claustrophobic sections where you get chased down, where you have to fight one of the vampire daughters, I got hit and hurt a lot as you try and find out how to beat them. So yeah, I did not die a lot, and I guess in retrospect the game was pretty easy, but to call the game a piece of cake is, I think, exaggerated, and I think the action and combat is tense enough to where it keeps you on the edge of your seat at all times. Even in the later stages of the games, enemies can still be very intimidating, with large drills attached to their arms and them being invulnerable except on a tiny spot on their back. There's a great selection of weapons as well, with your classics like the shotgun, the sniper rifle, the ultra-powerful magnum of course, only to use during emergencies like special bosses, or even machine guns and grenade launchers. All of these can be upgraded a bunch and customized for less recoil, more ammo, or increased zooming capabilities. It all works wonderful, and has you invested and wanting to find goodies and other valuables in order to make them better and stronger. You do these upgrades via a merchant called the Duke, who always hilariously pops up in the most absurd locations throughout the game. There's even a very charming and funny nod to the merchant from Resident Evil 4, where he quotes a famous line he says, and with Duke, you can buy items and upgrades like crafting recipes, more inventory slots, weapon upgrades, or sell any valuables you come across. Later on, you can even give him ingredients so he can cook you dishes for permanent upgrades to your health, defense, or movement speed. Pretty much all of these upgrades are incredibly useful, and I was always happy to see Duke pop up somewhere so I could sell all the treasure I had collected and work a bit on my weapons. It honestly feels way more rewarding and helpful to tinker with your weapons and stats in this game than with others. The game also showcases that it's not afraid to present itself as a game. Nowadays, games are all about cinematic experiences and immersion. Now, I also do have to say that I love these cinematic games that try to be very realistic with its world and setting, but RE Village, as did RE7 by the way, beautifully showcased that having your typical gaming tropes still could be super fun and not intrusive to the immersion at all. In this game, you have many times where there's a door that is locked off, and you need to collect 3 medallions in order to open it, or find 4 masks to put them on statues in order to open the door, etc. It's very classic in its puzzle sense in that way, and thereby also still really feeling like a Resident Evil game, thereby keeping itself close to being an RE title despite the drastic setting change. It's just still very fun and as engaging as ever to go on a scavenging hunt for these masks or medallions as you explore the various mansions, castles, and caves for the next item you will need. By having clever scripting and encounters with the various characters, the game also doesn't really feel like you are doing fetch quests where you're simply looking for one item and then the next, which sometimes can definitely be the case here. So let's get back to where we left off. Once you enter the castle, you finally get introduced to the main antagonists of the game, the 4 Lords and Mother Miranda. Now, I have to admit that I stopped watching any trailers and other promotional material for Resident Evil Village after the trailer showcasing the vampire ladies, so I was very surprised to find out that there were a whole bunch of other characters that played an important role in the story. From the loudmouth, cocky Heisenberg, to the misshaped and deformed Moreau, or the creepy-looking doll Angie and her maker Donna. And yes, of course also the lovely and sexy lady Dimitrescu. And no worries, I will make plenty of time to talk about this fine lady in due time, because with how crazy the internet went for her, she kinda deserves it. But as I said, I only had watched up until the Dimitrescu reveal trailer, and so for the longest time, I thought that Dimitrescu was the main bad guy, but it turns out she is only a small part of a much bigger cast. It honestly reminded me of Resident Evil 4, where for the longest time, I thought that the main bad guy was the tiny Napoleon-looking dude, and once I killed him, I thought I was close to the end of the game, but it turned out I was only halfway there. It's great, therefore, in my opinion, that the other characters beside Dimitrescu are very memorable and unique like the Doll Lady or Heisenberg. Dimitrescu undoubtedly is still the highlight of the 4 Lords, but they can each stand on their own 2 legs to have you interested to learn more about them. Once you escape after being initially captured by Heisenberg, you find yourself in the castle of Lady Dimitrescu and her 3 daughters. This whole section, which is pretty lengthy, is absolutely wonderful. The scenes with Dimitrescu and her daughters are great, with beautiful and subtle animations, like one of her daughters swirling a handkerchief or Dimitrescu applying lipstick while being on the phone. The environments are gorgeous and so fun to explore, with beautiful decorations everywhere. Each room is more beautiful than the next, and even the creepy dungeons and wine cellars are full of detail and great fun to explore. It's here too where once again it becomes clear how greatly written the background and lore is. You can find subtle hints and details about the daughters' origins, for example, and where their first names begin with letters B, C, and D, and indeed, their mother Dimitrescu has an A as her first name. The lore states, for example, that originally there were 4 girls, but one of them did not digest that, which would turn them into these bug-infested vampire ladies. Later then, you fight a regular zombie-looking enemy, and the enemy leaves a necklace on the ground that belongs to the 4th girl who didn't make it, meaning that she did not turn into a vampire and instead had been made into a regular zombie type. If you did not kill that particular enemy, the necklace will not drop, and you can overlook that entire detail, and I love that they went the extra mile to add details like this. The castle is pretty massive and offers plenty of goodies to collect and some great puzzles to try out as well. From the fights with the vampire daughters, where each time you need to break a window in a different way, or more traditional puzzles like set 4 statues in a certain direction or find 5 bells scattered around in a room. It doesn't tread new territory in terms of the puzzle types, but the result and execution is polished enough that it's really good. This place too is full of nods to the older games, with for example a puzzle involving a pressure plate, where you need to replace an important item with a fake one, just like you did with the shotgun in the very first Resident Evil game. It's also here where they have their version of Mr. X or Nemesis, this time in the form of Lady Dimitrescu. And before we take a deep dive at her character and how much she stirred up the internet, I first want to talk a bit about her mechanics. She basically stalks the castle halls and rooms in search for you, and will follow you if she sees you. She makes quite the impression when coming through a door, since she has to duck each time and rises up to showcase her impressive height. However, I do have to say that she definitely was not as intimidating as Mr. X, nor as scary. It felt to me that Mr. X walked faster and was way more scary looking and sounding. The loud thumping of his boots could be often heard from far away, or even above you if he was patrolling the halls there while you were in a room down below. It made you hold your breath to hope that he did not pick up upon your trail and was right about to crash into the room you were at. But with Dimitrescu, it's not as intimidating. You can hear her high heels if she is in a room or hall near you, and if you fire your gun, you can sometimes hear her make a sound that she has picked up on your trail. But she moves so slow to the point where I never was scared or intimidated by her. In all honesty, her daughters were way more freaky and scary, with the buzzing flies everywhere and constantly laughing and shouting grotesque things that they were going to do to me. I actually did not run into Dimitrescu that much in the castle, despite pretty much clearing all of the rooms and finding all the secrets. In a way, she felt a bit underused, and Mr. X definitely made a way bigger impression on me when it comes to gameplay alone. But let's now finally talk about Lady Dimitrescu herself, because wow, did she have the entire internet kneel at her giant feet. I honestly don't remember another female character that created so much uproar amongst gamers worldwide, and that all of a sudden, so many people were talking about a game character and interested in Resident Evil Village purely for this game character alone. It got to the point where people were wanting to know background story to pretty absurd lengths, like for example her actual height and body measurements. What's more is that through all the absurdity and articles written about this character, I found out about a whole bunch of fetishes I'd never heard of. Now I know that there are people out there with mommy complexes, which surely would like Dimitrescu, but I found out that there's apparently also a thing like a giantess fetish, where I guess you get turned on if a woman is a giant? Yeah, not sure how that works, but besides that fetish alone, there's of course also the fact that submissive men might go ham on Dimitrescu since she is such a dominant figure, and so maybe there can be some S&M mistress or dominatrix type of ordeal being at play here. There's even a cutscene where she really manhandles you, and that's probably the wet dream of most submissive men. There were some very hilarious memes and gifs of gamers worshipping Dimitrescu, and it made me laugh how much she had wrapped the attention of so many people around her finger. It's even to the point where Capcom got overwhelmed with how popular she became, which becomes very clear when you realize how little she is in the game. Honestly, I don't know. I'm a simple man. I'm a boob kind of guy, so I loved Lady Dimitrescu as well the moment I laid eyes upon her. But not because she was a giant, or because she was so dominant. But it was because of, and I quote the great poet Dave Chappelle, "Damn, look at them titties!" Yeah, no, sorry. Every time Dimitrescu was talking to me, my eyes would wander off down below, and they liked what they saw. But all jokes aside, I will say this. Dimitrescu is very hot, and one of the sexiest game characters out there, despite not showing too much skin. They show a lot of cleavage, yes, but she is not wearing next to nothing, as characters like Quiet from Metal Gear Solid, which was just a dumb excuse to lure in a few extra desperate horny gamers. And I have to reiterate that there's nothing wrong, in my opinion, with showing some TNA in a game. I mean, I used to play the hell out of Dead or Alive Extreme Beach Volleyball when I was a teen, and not for the volleyball, I can tell you. But don't go and pretend it's more than just a cheap shill, like having a backstory where she needs to breathe through her skin blah 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 blah, like it was with the character Quiet. Just admit, hey guys, you like tits? Well, here you got him, enjoy. And Dimitrescu, on the other hand, is way more elegant, yet so much more sexy than most of these scantily clad characters. Every animation she does is flirtatious and very feminine, and the voice actress does a great job as well in bringing one of the most memorable characters in recent gaming come to life. But then let's also talk about the big elephant in the room, and that is the fact that Dimitrescu is actually not in the game a lot at all. In fact, she is in it less than a quarter of it, I would say. And she is only the first of the 4 lords you will face, and is the first to die and be wiped from the script. Yeah, I was a bit surprised because, as I said, the trailer made it seem like she was almost an end boss type level character. And in that sense, it actually is very clever marketing, because from the trailer onward, they always use her for the marketing of this game, but the truth is that she is only in it for a very short fraction, and very early on too. After she is gone, you still have more than 10 hours or so to go, where she does not play a role in it anymore. Now, though it might seem like I present this as a negative, I don't actually see it this way. Now, this will require a bit of explanation. First, let me say that I thought in the end it's actually a good thing that they did not revolve the entire game about Lady Dimitrescu, and instead stuck to their original vision by having her be one of the 4 lords, instead of catering to the masses' wishes of altering the script or story because all of a sudden a certain character becomes so popular. If they had altered it, or used Dimitrescu the entire way through, it could feel a bit gimmicky or cheap just to get in the horny boys. By actually having Dimitrescu being a small part, and then thereafter still having quality content with other interesting characters, it makes the game all the more noteworthy and praiseworthy. Now, I do have to admit that once I killed her so early on, that a part of me was a bit anxious and nervous if they would pull off a Vaz from Far Cry 3. You see, the bad guy was the constant face of the marketing for that game as well, and it made it seem like he would be the end boss. But he actually dies halfway through, and you have a long chunk of game after that point on, where the replacing bad guy is not half as interesting as Vaz is. It genuinely makes it a bit lesser of an experience, and I was afraid that this would happen here too, where the next antagonist after Dimitrescu would not be as memorable or intriguing, and that all the parts after this would be way less. Resident Evil 2, even the remake, kinda has this too, where the absolute highlight was the police station, but after that, when you get into the sewers, it becomes a bit generic. Even Resident Evil 7, which I love, drops a bit in quality once you arrive on the ship. Luckily, I can tell you that the parts after Dimitrescu are still great, and some even have some absolute highlights attached to them as well. I will indeed say that none of them have the same charisma as Dimitrescu, but as I said, I was still as much intrigued and invested during the parts after the castle, though the environments never reached that beauty and wanting to explore as was with the castle. Now, it was pretty funny because while playing the parts after, I was thinking of the people who purely bought this game for Lady Dimitrescu and how they would likely be let down that she is only in it for such a short time. Then I thought that you might even have people going and write about it, and look and behold, as I'm writing this review, I literally saw articles pop up by professional game journalists who whine about the fact that Lady Dimitrescu is not in the game enough. Honestly, Jesus wept, and game journalism is dead. They even hope that she will get resurrected in upcoming titles, and though I found Dimitrescu incredibly charming and beautiful as well, I hope they don't. I dislike it if a creator or artist alters his or her vision because the masses demand it. Where they kill off a certain character and then find out that they become incredibly popular and then have them come back to life in some of the most contrived ways. Star Wars has multiple of those characters. Now, I won't say that I won't be happy when I get to gaze upon the big titties of Dimitrescu once more if she comes back to life, but I simply hope they won't bring her back just because she suddenly became so popular. Maybe if they do another reboot someday, they can do her justice. Alright, we finally got done talking about Lady Dimitrescu. Though I don't want to spell out the entire game throughout this video, I still would like to talk about some of the noteworthy sections that come after this. First, it should also be said that the overall exploration in the game is excellent. So much of the stuff that you find is useful, making the exploring bit all the more rewarding and fun to do. In so many games that have exploration and finding loot and items, so many of the items are things you will never use and it doesn't feel as rewarding. But here, every bullet is valuable. Every treasure means another possible upgrade. Every crafting item means more ammo. And there are several treasures to be found as well that require a bit more finesse and searching or completing a bit more of a complex puzzle. You come back to the village multiple times, and every time you have new items like a certain key or a well wheel to access new areas or items. The backtracking does not feel tedious, and you can clearly see if you have fully explored an area or not by the color that a certain area has on the map. During the backtracking, you will also sometimes stumble upon optional bosses which are really tough, but very rewarding to beat. From troll-looking axe-wielding giants to enormous alpha wolves that take an incredible amount of punishment before they go down. It makes you still on the edge of your seat even if you are treading on familiar ground. But so after you are done with the Dimitrescu castle, you head to a mansion at the far side of the village on a cliff where the doll maker lives. Now, people who have watched this channel for a long time know that I hate dolls. It's one of the horror tropes I really find scary, and dear God, the dolls in this game are very scary indeed. First of all, it should be said that this whole section looks gorgeous. The way towards the mansion is very ominous, with dolls that look like they hang themselves from trees and a massive grave dedicated to the mother of the doll maker. Her mansion itself is still beautiful and detailed, more reminiscing of the mansion from the first game instead of a majestic castle. The interiors and rooms are all beautifully filled with detailed objects and assets, just like the castle, and it makes it to where this area is also great to explore, though very scary and eerie. It is this section where the game also takes your weapons and inventory away and instead turns into more of an escape room-esque experience where you need to collect a bunch of items and complete a set of puzzles to progress. In a sense, this is mirroring the Lucas area from Resident Evil 7, where you also don't have a weapon but need to complete a bunch of puzzles in a small room to progress. I have to say here and praise the game for going back to such a slow and scary pace after just having completed the castle. There might have been other creators out there who believed that they would have to dial the action up a notch after completing the castle chapter. But RE Village instead takes a step back and offers you an entire section where you cannot fight, and it all revolves around exploring this incredibly creepy building and solving puzzles while you being on the edge the entire time since you are afraid something will jump right up at you. It's so well done, and even though almost nothing happens, it's still so tense and scary. The section with the well, seeing a sudden ghostly figure behind a window, the lights suddenly going off. I had goosebumps multiple times, and this is yet again such a good thing that the game remembers it's a horror game at its core. Such a great balance between action and horror with RE Village. And once you do finally see what is laying in wait for you, it's very disturbing, and it resorts to a more recent horror trope where you cannot fight and instead need to hide underneath beds or inside closets. This part was pretty short, though, and I only needed to hide once, but I prefer that over the alternative where in so many horror games nowadays, where it becomes trial and error by trying to find where you need to go while being caught by the monster chasing you. But this goes for multiple of the areas in that they are pretty short, especially after the castle. The castle area lasted a good 3 hours or so for me, since I explored everything and wanted to find every secret. But the next Lord's area, and the one after that, I both finished in under an hour each. It's also worth mentioning that each major zone has a pretty fun special puzzle where you need to rotate a 3D board and guide a golden ball through a tiny maze. You need to stop tilting at the right times to avoid it falling off the edge, and as I said, it's very simple, but it's a fun little distraction that I'm pretty glad that they put in, and the rewards you get for solving these puzzles are always excellent. The treasure hunting in general is also pretty cool, with sometimes finding photos or maps of certain treasures or rare animals to where you need to identify hints from the pictures or the drawn map. It feels like you are required to do a little bit of extra detective work, but I of course love detective games, so this addition was greatly appreciated. The next zone afterward revolves around dangers looming in the water as you are being chased by a giant fish monster. This of course is then an homage to the fish monster section from Resident Evil 4, which was one of the most memorable and intense parts of that game, where you were in just a little wooden boat up against a giant behemoth underwater. They also did a water monster section in Resident Evil 6, but that entire game sucks, and that section also sucked. And yes, I do think Leon's campaign in that game is also really crap, unlike some saying that the Leon campaign is the only redeeming quality of it. I hope to someday do a review of Resident Evil 6 for the channel, but that game is like 20 hours long, and I kinda have to put myself in a certain state to play a game that crappy for such a long time. Anyway, back to this gem of a game. So this section has you walk across walkways and interact with switches to lower and raise bridges while avoiding the fish monster, who will surface every now and then to take a bite at you. The antagonist in this section is Dr. Moreau, who is this horribly disfigured fishman creature, and in all honesty, I kind of felt sorry for the fella rather than feel hatred for it. He is so deformed and hideous that he is being picked on, and due to his disability, he's not able to do much and therefore appease Mother Miranda, the one person he absolutely worships. He kinda just lost at life due to how deformed he is, and he wants to impress his mother so bad. I kinda felt pity for him, I won't lie. Even during the boss fight, he cries and whines and makes more of a sad, pitiful impression than one that is intimidating. But then again, he is half disgusting fish, so what would you expect? The cool thing about this part is that yet again, the gameplay is completely changed, where you are just busy with avoiding and dealing with this giant fish monster. The first castle area was all about exploring, dealing with Dimitrescu and her daughters, and collecting masks. The second area was then all about solving the escape room-esque puzzles while focusing on the tiny doll, and here, you are dealing with the puzzles while avoiding the fish monster. The section after that then has some more traditional action again, with you facing off against waves of lichens, and eventually you make it up to the fourth zone, which is the gigantic factory. Now in general, I don't really like the industrial areas, and yeah, as I said before, I do prefer Lady Dimitrescu's castle and Donna's mansion over this factory, but I have to say that they do a pretty good job of making it look and feel pretty impressive. You have these zombie-looking soldiers being transported in the backgrounds on cranes, and you mostly are busy with getting the power back on by collecting various molds, and fighting off horribly-looking bad guys that can only be killed by hitting them in certain spots, and dealing with a nemesis-type giant monster that chases you throughout several sections. And then you haven't even gotten to the final area yet. The game itself is absolutely massive for a single-player game. In the past, there have been Resident Evil games that have been very short and you could easily complete in 4 to 5 hours. Last year's disappointing Resident Evil 3 remake is a great example of this. But with Resident Evil Village, it took me over 16 hours to complete it, and I just love how chock full of content it is and how it just keeps on going and going and going. Each time you think you get close to the end, there's another zone to explore or another antagonist to face off against. It really reminded me in a way of Resident Evil 4 that also just kept going and going and going and giving you more excellent gameplay and monsters and characters to deal with. Each time you head to a new area in RE Village, you are so excited with what they have in store for you next. What kind of gameplay you can expect, what kind of new enemies, etc. And though it indeed never reaches that level of the first castle again, the areas are still engaging and fun enough to where it keeps you going and wanting to know more. It's definitely not the case with something like Resident Evil 7, where it starts to lose your interest when you are on the ship. Now for those who only wanted to play this for Dimitrescu, you might be disappointed. But in my opinion, you bought this game for the wrong reasons. Lady Dimitrescu is more like a delicious cherry on top of a great tasting cake. So we have finally come to the conclusion of the game, and I was thinking of some minor points that I had with the game. Maybe the only thing that comes to mind, which in and of itself is a bit minor or nitpicky, but I thought that the sound design was sometimes a bit lackluster. The pistol sound is very weak, and I know it's supposed to be a weak weapon, but it sounds like it has no impact at all, whereas pistols in older RE games had way better sound. Also, enemy sounds sometimes are a bit cliché and overused, like the generic stock lion sound, which gets used over and over again, even with different types of enemies. Other than that, I think this game is amazing. It has the exact right amount of exploration and wonder in a game where I want to search out every nook and cranny to get every last treasure or secret. It has a mysterious story with a great cast of memorable characters that will keep you guessing and wanting to know more all throughout. The art design and graphics are top-notch, and so many of the environments are a true joy to explore, though I guess it is a bit of a shame that the absolute highlight of those comes so early on in the game. And lastly, the gameplay is just very solid and varied, with each zone focusing on something different entirely. It can be compared with how in Resident Evil 7 each family member and their zone cater to a different style of horror, with Jack Baker catering to the slasher/stalker type horror like Jason or Halloween, with a bulky character stalking you with a melee weapon. And the mother had the monster horror, as grotesque bucks would chase you in the style of so many monster or animal horror movies out there. And the son then was all about mechanical death traps in the spirit of Saw and Hostel, and just like that, Resident Evil Village caters to different styles as well, though more in a classical sense. The castle deals with vampires and bulking giantesses, the dollmaker's house deals with my personal phobia, which are dolls, the Moreau area deals with the fear of sharks or what is underwater, and the factory is more of a body horror, with drills, spikes, and other metal tools attached and ripped into bodies. In the end, I can recommend Resident Evil Village to any person who loves single-player gaming. There's something to love here for everyone, and only if you're a really big scaredy cat to where you cannot handle such things, I would say don't try it. Other than that, you are truly missing out if you don't check out this title, and in the end, Resident Evil Village gets a 9.1. I'm very curious on what Capcom does next, and from what I understand, the game is getting very good reviews. I hope that they will stay true to their horror roots, and not go the same route, but it seemed that they struck gold twice with RE7 and RE8, so I'm already all aboard for when eventually RE9 will show its horribly looking face. But, will that be with or without delicious Lady Dimitrescu?